All right, many thanks, Abosede. When Nigeria grows enough food to feed itself, the problem is not production. It is what happens between the farm and the table. Tonight, we'll examine a crisis that costs this country 5 trillion naira every year and the practical steps that could turn that loss into wealth. Now, the Nigerian Food Report, 35 million metric tons lost annually. And that's the 5 trillion naira leak. Now, Nigeria's annual food waste crisis and the practical path to turning waste into wealth. Let's look at the figures now. 35 million metric tons wasted annually. That's 50% of this perishable foods. 40% plus, that's over 40% of tomatoes spoilage before reaching the market. That's also very worrisome. 1,000 cold chain trucks. That's 25,000 that is needed practically. If we look at the figures, we need 25,000 and we have 1,000. Well, of course, that tells you what that means for the sector in its entirety. Now, where Nigeria's food is lost, unlike wealthier nations where waste happens largely at the consumer end, Nigerian crisis is concentrated at the post-harvest stage. Let's look at the farm. 15% loss. Estimated loss harvesting damage, field losses, animal pest attacks. For storage, 25% loss. Estimated loss, no cold storage, humidity, heat, rodent damage. Transport, 20% loss, estimated loss, bad roads, no refrigeration, and delays to get to the market. For processing, 10% loss, estimated loss. Now, low-tech handling and contamination, and of course, lack of facilities. Market, 5%. Unsold surplus, point of sale spoilage, and no cold display. Now, storage and transport losses are the most preventable. Both require infrastructure, which Nigeria currently lacks at the moment. If you look at the figures that we have, and cold chain capacity sale, warehousing, and reliable rural roads will help address some of these challenges. Now to the next slide. Now, what drives the waste? 4 drivers sustain the crisis. Nigeria again has fewer than 1,000 refrigerating trucks against the documented needed approximately 25,000. Now let's start with infrastructure. We've talked about poor storage systems, bad rural roads that physically damage produce in transit, broken value chains, disconnection between rural production and urban demand, the movement of food produce from the rural areas to the urban areas. It takes time, and sometimes there's this issue of waste, of course, always occurs one way or the other. Overproduction without marching markets, pest diseases, policy gaps, and of course, compound losses. Poor post-harvest handling, inefficient harvesting, drying and processing. Over 40% of tomatoes can spoil even before reaching the market. Moisture content in grains not properly managed. Well, the big one, insecurity and input deficits. Armed conflicts disrupt farming belts, lack of quality seeds, fertilizer, Middle Eastern crisis, that's impacting on the price of urea and fertilizer. That's also a negative. And inputs, other inputs for agriculture, limited processing capacity that could extend the shelf life and add value to this farm produce. The 4 consequences. This is not an agricultural problem. It's a national security problem. Nigeria produces enough food in theory, but waste erases that surplus. That's what we're looking at. Food insecurity and hunger. Enough food. We talked about waste, a systemic failure of distribution and preservation. Environmental cost. Decomposing food waste releases methane and greenhouse gases. It also wastes the embedded water, land, and energy used in production, compounding Nigeria's land degradation and climate exposure. Well, economic damage, farmers and consumers. Farmers lose income. Obviously, when you can't get your produce to the people to buy, to consumers, you definitely lose income. And from spoiled produce, consumers face higher prices. from artificially reduced supply. Foregone exports revenues add to the GDP drag. Food inflation compounds the harm. Let's look at the figures even from food inflation. We see it's always on the high side. Contribution of the GDP, that's agriculture to Nigeria's GDP, is not also as it should be to address food security, which is very important. Now, malnutrition and social harm. Reduced access to nutritious food worsens malnutrition, especially in vulnerable populations. This directly undermines Nigeria's obligations under the SDGs framework on zero hunger and, of course, responsible consumption. Now let's move to see the 5 pathways to change. 1. Cold chain infrastructure. These are very important interventions. Scale up cold storage hubs, refrigerated transport, modern warehouses in production zones. Accelerate the post-harvest systems transformation program with private sector capital. Now, understand with me that a multi-pronged approach, none of these 5 points works in isolation. Value addition and processing. Modular processing plants near farms, drying, canning, packaging, turns perishable surplus into stable products, creating jobs and extending shelf lives. Technology and farmer training, hermetic storage bags, optimal moisture drying techniques, digital markets, platforms to match surplus supplies with buyers before spoilage. Policy and coordination, very important. Model Ghana's YAM, looking at Ghana now, the framework, coordinated incentives, export standards, R&D funding, public-private partnerships, Nigeria's wide road network for agricultural belts. The AFCFTA is also supposed to promote movement of products across the board, and you will agree with me that countries like Ghana are benefiting more from this because they are putting in the right techniques into addressing the challenges of post-harvest losses. Awareness and redistribution, educating on the households and markets waste reduction, apps and community initiatives to redirect near expiry safe foods to vulnerable populations. Well, 35 million metric tons of food lost. 5 trillion naira is wasted. That's according to data. In a country where millions go hungry. Now, the question is not whether Nigeria can afford to fix this, it's whether Nigeria can afford not to. Well, that's it for our big story today.